Welcome back to another episode of Who Cares Anyway, sports podcast where I give you my opinions, and if you agree with me, cool. If you don't, cool. At the end of the day, who cares anyway? The intro rings true in this episode more than any of my past episodes. Um, and I know I say this a lot, but this episode is gonna be gonna be real different. This is a topic that I've had on my mind for some time now. It's also one that's recently that I've seen on social media be debated. Um, and before I get into this, I want to say that I'm not. I want to preface this by saying this is purely opinion. I'm in no way any more qualified than the next person to give my opinion on this topic. Um, I'm not throwing anyone under the bus. Um, and my opinions on the matter may differ from everyone else's. And like I said, the intro kind of rings true in this episode more than any other. If you agree, cool. If you don't, cool. At the end of the day, who cares? Um, but today I want to talk about the topic of coaching. Um, I have to kind of like uh go about this a certain way. Um, and I kind of want to go at this from the angle of coaching at levels earlier than college, right? So high school and younger. And I feel like this is something that I wanted to talk about because when you're dealing with, when you're dealing with athletes from the ages of 17 and younger, 18 and younger, it takes a special kind of a tact, right? It takes an ability to kind of manage emotions. Um, for you really kind of have to play. In my opinion, my humble opinion, you kind of have to play. You kind of have to wear the hat of not only coach but guidance counselor. And I technically that's not your job as a high school coach or as a coach of a of younger athletes. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to play that role at times because athletes of that age they're dealing with this emotional range that at times can come up. These radical changes in their emotions can come up during practices or during games, and there's no one left to deal with it but you as the coach, right? Um, and I'm not saying you got to run a daycare, right? You're kind of putting trust into these athletes and hoping that they can handle some of it on their own. But what I'm saying is there are things that you have to kind of that coaches kind of have to prevent themselves from doing to keep themselves to keep their players, I guess, even keel in a sense. Um, and I'm not saying you can't be stern with your player, like coaches can't be stern with their players, and they can't, kind of lay down the law in a sense, or like they don't have to, like these players don't have to get coddled up until like there's a certain age range mm, where that's debatable because at some point they're still kids, right? Um, but I think there's a point where there's a line, right, where you can't cross from sternness into just belligerent yelling and screaming and cursing at your players. And I feel like that's the case for a few reasons because one, w- at what point is that coaching? Like where is the coaching in that, right? And granted, you know, everybody has a leash. Everybody has a fuse. And when you're dealing with, especially in sports, when you're dealing with younger athletes, you're trying to get them to do something in a certain way. They may not always get it on first try. They may not always get it on second or third try. But when you when it becomes like when they're getting, when when the fuse is getting to its end and you're kind of at that point where okay, they have to get it at this point because if they don't get it, it's wasting our time. It can't turn into this screaming match. It can't turn into this belittlement of your players. Um, I say that because as a former athlete myself, I've seen how some of the how this turns out in some occasions, and especially high school athletes. But most players will have one of a few reactions to getting yelled at or screamed at, or well, it's kind of the same concept, screaming and yelling, or getting cursed at for something that they did wrong, and they'll either a shut down and just become unresponsive to everything, to almost everything. I was one of those players. I was the type to just shut down, and I would not want to hear anything from anyone, regardless of what it was. Um, or and in that case, it's not helpful to anyone because now they're not accepting coaching. They're not and a lot of times they're standing off to the side, kind of just not wanting to participate in practice or in anything, depending on when it happens. Um, and now they're kind of out of that focus because instead of being focused on executing and playing, their focus has shifted onto this stifled anger, right? Um, there's another in other occasions, a player might fly into this defensive or combative state of rage where it now does become a screaming match and they're going back and forth with the coach, and that doesn't help anyone because at that point you're putting a halt on practice, or you're putting a halt on on like what's trying to happen, or on the goal that you're trying to reach, whether it be in a game situation. And I kind of separate games and practice because obviously two different scenarios, right? But I think in practice situations, you kind of as a coach, there needs to be a little more leeway because mistakes are supposed to happen. It's practice. That's what you're there for. Now, granted, it can't be. Again, there's a leash, there's a fuse. Like you can't just let them endlessly make mistakes. But they're they got a little. There has to be a little more, give, because if they're not allowed to make mistakes in practice and kind of iron out those wrinkles, then come game situation, those mistakes that were happening in practice are going to come up in the games. Um, yeah, and I'll continue that tangent in a little bit. But there's also occasions where players will tense up, and when you tense up as an athlete, it's not healthy because that leads to injuries, and now you're the best way to describe it is if you you took a rubber band and you pulled it all the way to its full extent, and then tried to put it around, like you tried to move it in a separate, in a different action while it was pulled at its full extent, right? And that's kind of what happened. That's kind of how your muscles work. If you tense your muscles up and you try to make a move at when your muscles are fully tensed, especially in how do I want to say this? Especially in sports, when you are fully like they tell you, as especially and as a football player and as a quarterback at that, um, they always say the blindside hits don't hurt as bad as the hits that you can see coming, because when you can see a hit coming, you tense. You know that hit is coming, so you tense up because you're trying to brace for the hit. And since your body is already tensed, when you take that hit, it rings out through your muscles now. Whereas if you take a blindside hit, you have no idea that hit is coming. So when you take the hit, your body is loose and able to kind of let the force of that hit kind of just play out. Um, but when players are tense, making sudden cuts and sudden moves and doing things like and taking hits or doing whatever can lead to more injury because now that muscle is already tense as is, and now you're trying to get it to do something else while tense. Um, but it also has the ability to poorly affect play. You know, when think of it as if you were at work, right? And you're in this state of tense, this you know, you're tensed up all day, you're anxious, and you're trying to accomplish a task. You're not fully focused on that task because you're still tensed up with you know with anxiety or anger or whatever the case may be, and you, it just tends to lead to poor execution because you're how do I want to say this? I don't want to say you're trying to over execute because that's not exactly what it is, but it's just harder to execute as an athlete when you're not playing loose, right? And my fellow athletes understand that, and my fellow former athletes, I should say, or people who are athletes now, they understand what I'm trying to say. Like when you're intense, when your body is tense, not necessarily when you're in tense situations, because when you're in a tense situation, you still have the ability to play loosely through that tenseness. But when your body is tense, it's like your body's stiffening and you're not able to really move the way you want to move and do the things that you need to do in order to execute properly. That's exactly what I was trying to say. I don't know why it took me so long to get to that point. Moving on. Um, there's also a possibility that a player can become fearful of not executing correctly, right? And in doing so, they may over execute, right? Or they may cut themselves short or not do certain things that should be done because they're in this state of I don't want to do this because if I do this, I might get yelled at. But it's quite possible that what they have in mind could be seen or perceived as a good idea based off of what's happening in front of them. Um, and I say all of this right to say playing in an environment like this it isn't it isn't healthy for player mentality, right? It also isn't healthy for chemistry because you get into these spots where now there's this air of dislike in the locker room, this air of disdain in the locker room, and you don't have to like your coaches. Like your coaches don't have to be your favorite people, but these are people you spend 80% of your time with. Well, it's a little different when you're a high school athlete. It's probably about like 60, right? Like you spend a lot of time around your coaches, and when it's a coach you interact with, because in certain sports, you don't necessarily directly interact with every coach, but when it's a coach that you directly interact with, it become it you kinda I feel you dread practice at that point because 'cause you're like, "Ah, I don't wanna deal with this person," right? And that's never good because the practice is what gets you better, right? And if you don't wanna be there, you're not gonna put your full effort into trying to get better. And even if you are putting your full effort into trying to get better, you you may have this this feeling of no matter what you do, you can do no right. Um, and it also there's also along with that dislike and that disdain, there's also this air of anxiety now that gets built up, and which is pretty easy to do among high school kids and younger. Um, and with when you have anxious players, their judgment isn't clear, right? And like I said earlier, now they're either not doing things out of fear of being wrong, or they're doing things out of fear of being wrong. And it kind of hinders what you're trying to do as a team because now we're not acting not only on one accord, but we're not acting according to plan. Um, and to go along with the idea that it creates this dislike and disconnect between players and coaches. Um, it I f- I feel it makes it hard to want to go out and I'm gonna use football as the example, right? Because in football, you always hear, leave everything you have out on the field. When you don't like the coaches you're playing for, I feel it makes it very hard to leave everything out on the field because your coaches are supposed to be the people you're following in the battle. And if you don't like the people you're following in the battle, are you really gonna follow them all the way? So it's I feel it makes it difficult to give it your all when you need to give it your all. Um, I think that's all I have on that one. And like I said earlier, I wanna separate practice and game situations because practice, like I said, is meant to mistakes are meant to be made, and those are settings that are supposed to be used to teach players and correct players for game situations, right? I don't think practice situations should be used to belittle or diminish players just because something went wrong. Um, I I think that in practice you kind of gotta let your players make mistakes and then correct them accordingly, and according to the situation and also according to the player, right? Because not every player takes to the same coaching style, right? Um, And if you are just sitting there when a player does something wrong, regardless of what it is and regardless of how many times they've done it wrong, it really does become this situation where they're remembering the things that were said to belittle them and kind of diminish them as a player and as a person at times over the coaching point and the coaching moment that was tied to that belittlement, right? And in that case, it really is, who are we helping at that point? Who are you helping? Because if they don't remember the coaching moment, that mistake is going to happen again. And like I said, not every player takes to the same coaching style, you know, um, and sometimes yelling isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? But it really is this fine line of how you kind of handle certain situations. Um, and I'm only one perspective, and I think in the future I kind of want to revisit this topic with one or more people to kind of bounce this off of, um, because it's a very I feel it's a delicate space. It's a delicate topic. And, people who aren't athletes probably don't feel that way because coaching is coaching. But I think at some point there is a difference between a good and a bad coach. There is a difference between good coaching and bad coaching moments. And like I said, not every player, I really think you kind of have to discern what players adhere to what coaching style. Not every player is gonna sit there and listen to you yell at them and still try and go full effort, full throttle, and be able to hear the coaching point behind, be able to sift through the words that don't matter to the coaching moment and pull the coaching moment out. You know, when you're especially I feel especially high school age, but when you're high school age and younger, nerves are very much a thing. It's very easy to get nervous. And some players you get yelled at once and your nerves shoot through the roof. And now you're not able to perform the way you need to perform or correct what you need to correct because you're you're shaking in your boots a little bit because you're like, oh, I don't want to get yelled at again, but I don't, like, I know what I need to do, but I don't know that I can do it, and it just becomes this loop that never fixes itself. I think that's all I got. Um, like I said, I want to come back to this at some point down the line, just because I am one perspective, so I only have so much to say on this perspective and on this topic, and I feel like I didn't really say that. I don't want to say I didn't say a whole lot, but I feel like I didn't say everything that there is to be said about it, right? And like I said, I was one of those players that was shut down when getting yelled at for whatever, you know, but hearing from different people that took to different coaching styles or took to getting yelled at differently, and being able to kind of bounce those perspectives off each other and play a little back and forth, I feel like would flesh this out a little more. But I just wanted to drop this in here and kind of put this out there and give a little bit of my take as I do every week. Um, Speaking of, I think we're gonna move upload days back to Friday. Just a little bit of a housekeeping thing. Um, yeah, I think we're gonna move upload days back to Friday. For the last, I want to say, month or so, I've been uploading Wednesdays during in like the middle of the day. But I think Friday might be a better day. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. Um, that's kind of it. That's kind of it. Maybe not. Stay tuned for something that might be in the works. I don't know when it's gonna drop. I don't know when it's gonna come out, but just keep your eyes peeled. It's gonna be something completely different from this, a completely separate, I guess, genre is the best way to put it. Uh, Definitely not the same topic of conversation. Definitely a little heavier than this. Um, but yeah, there's something in the works. Um, so just kind of keep your eyes peeled for that. And like I say at the beginning of every episode, like I say at the end of every, I'm gonna try to say, I try to say it at the end of every episode. At the end of the day, who cares anyway?